The youngest officer was probably the most skillful swordsman in the army. Though his comrades did not realize the fact, he brought with him a bundle of swords of different kinds, and one of the sergeants, anxious to teach the newcomer a lesson, challenged him to a bout. The sergeant, who had a close reputation as a man of arms, chose the bayonet against the young ensign's sword, but was easily worsted, and the result was the same when the weapons were changed. After this feat, the young officer was invited to form a fencing class for the officers and non-commissioned officers, and the swordsmanship of the regiment was greatly improved. So as we started this channel, we've seen a ton of different types of swords that we've looked at. We started to look all throughout history. We're going to be looking today at kind of a more modern sense of a sword, what they've evolved into. So kind of a brief history of what swords looked like. Originally, in the classical period, you had small swords like this made out of bronze. And over time, as metallurgy improved, they switched over to steel. They switched over to more high carbon metals. Eventually, we run into something like this in the medieval period. This is the Albion Burgundian. You can see it's a beautiful sword. We've got keons on both sides, double-edged blade, a pommel, which is kind of the foundation of all European swords. The further on we get into history, we find more of a need to protect that outside of the hand. Back in the old days, what they'd do is they'd have a buckler that they'd use to protect it, kind of like a small shield, or you'd have to train more and more to turn that blade to the outside as you made those cuts. But a lot of times, especially when we're doing fencing nowadays, we're getting hit on the outside of the hand. So they invented better gauntlets. As gauntlets developed, they became more expensive, but they protected the hand very well. Eventually, especially after the Black Death, people started to demand higher wages for their service in the military. So as we start looking more and more, the shift from gauntlets, especially as firearms came out, start to go less and less, but we still have that desire to protect the back of your hand. So we start running into things like this messer, again in the medieval period, going out through the Renaissance. This started as kind of a small knife, and they saw the nagel on there, like, oh, hey, that's pretty cool. So they made the knife bigger. Now it's a sword size, and you have that nagel to protect the outside of your hand. And this type of protection extended throughout the medieval period. Eventually, they turned into rings, sometimes rings on both sides, sometimes a full basket hilt, like a rapier, to help protect an unprotected hand. Over time, as European armies developed, the use of the sword became less and less important, but still needed. And towards the end of the Renaissance period, towards the early modern period, we start looking at pike blocks, light cavalry, lots of massed munitions-grade troops. We start running into sabers that look like this, swords that look like this. Now, this is what we would traditionally call a saber. And sabers comes from a Polish word, zabla, I think is how you pronounce that. I'll ask somebody about that later. But the zabla was a sword that had protection on both sides, had a simple construction, and a lot of them only have one edge. So this became super popular, especially with light cavalry, becoming more popular as we start to move throughout time. And as soldiers had even less and less armor, this became the primary defensive function of whatever equipment that you were wearing. So in the late 1670s, we start to run into a lot more of these appearing throughout Europe. This is the time of the Ottoman invasions, the time where the English start to have their civil wars. We start to develop more and more of these very simple swords to hand out to large numbers of troops. Usually we see them on horseback or for some kind of officers. And that's where this type of sword comes in. And this type of sword is still popular today. It's one of the only types of swords that are still handed out to people for their dress uniforms. So anytime you see the Marines dress up in their really nice uniforms, or we have a group of people that are doing salutes to the flag, it's almost certainly going to be with a saber. So this is something that our great-grandparents would have used in combat, and I find that to be absolutely incredible. One of my favorite stories of these types of sword come from a dude named Alfred Hutton. And Hutton, you may consider to be the first early modern Hemaist. He was especially famous for popularizing the use of the sword in the late 19th century with his regiment, and he wrote a book called Cold Steel, and he's one of the primary fencing sources that a lot of us have when we look at the saber. because of his influence, we start to run into where the concept of HEMA, or at least as it was back in the day, began to develop into Olympic fencing. You can still see this sort of sword that people use in Olympic fencing. It's not used how traditional sabers would have been used, but that's where the carryover comes from the saber. So this was a very popular sword through all strata of society. Governments issued them to troops, and this is something that a lot of people were training with all the way up until about World War I. So if you're interested in the most common sword, at least of our lifetimes, our generations, you'd probably be looking at the saber. So this saber right here specifically is from Swordier, link in the description. This right here is a very budget-friendly option, and that was kind of the reason that I wanted to get this. If you remember from a few months ago, we had somewhat of a dispute between Matt Easton and the Swordier guys about this being a direct copy of the Covetton-Easton saber. Aesthetically, they do use a lot of the same pieces, especially that flower guard at the end. I wouldn't call this anywhere near the same quality as like a Covetton saber. But this being about $200 versus a Covetton, to get it here, it's usually between $600 and $700. So if you're not concerned too much with the quality, we just need a beater sword. That's what I would consider this. So if I had a golden apple and I could trade it for one saber, and you have a Covetton and a Swordier here, I would choose the Covetton every time. But if I'm arming a group of people in my fencing club and we just need a lot of spare sabers, this is a great option. Like I said, it's about $200. This is the older model. I had the newer model, and I'll play some fencing footage over here on the side of us talking about the differences between the two of them, seeing them beat up against each other. But overall, I think this thing has proved to be quite durable. A big problem with a lot of these sabers, especially in the HEMA community, is you'll see that this guard will loosen up after a lot of bashes. And I have another saber right here where you can hear it, and it's pretty frustrating when the handle loosens up. It doesn't really affect the function, but it makes it feel a lot less cool to wield. Because of that, we have a little bit more stability in the hand. And that makes you feel better, have a higher morale when you're fencing. We all know that morale equals hit points in the tournament ring. So if you don't have to worry about your gear, you have one less thing to worry about when you're fighting your opponents. Now, the saber, we've talked about it being a sword that was dished out to all the strata of society, and that this would be something that people would train with no matter what social class that you come from. And saber is probably one of the easiest types of sword to learn. And for that reason, I think this is a great option. So saber, 99% of the systems, and there's even systems that are only a couple of pages long from the Victorian period, where it's literally, if they're attacking you, you put that guard on the outside. So if they're attacking here, they're cutting down at me, you can put that guard on the outside there. If they're attacking me over here, you can put the guard on the outside there. If they're attacking you from above, you can go to St. George's guard up here and just block it. And then there's this lovely thing called a moulinet, where they hit your sword and it will come off and you can whip it around and cut, using the force of their blade to cut. And moulinet is really where the saber comes into its element. Blocking, cutting, blocking, cutting, blocking, cutting, blocking, cutting. You can do all kinds of things with a saber. And it doesn't take a whole lot of training to make yourself look really cool while using it. So if you're looking for a good secondary weapon to train, I'd even recommend this. In my opinion, it works kind of like a rapier, just less sophisticated. So you don't need as much training. But it is something that most people can understand fairly easily. You don't need to be a high IQ individual for a saber. So anyone that's looking for a spare one, this is a great option. Now, this saber specifically, we wanted to make sure that it was super durable. Because it is a budget option, like I said, you run into that issue where the guard will start to loosen up over time. We do also have a concern that perhaps this bell would start to get impacted over time. You can see on the inside there, we have just kind of like a dome on the inside. We see no noticeable issues here, and we were going hard with these sabers. We were attacking people as hard as we could, and I told these two fencers over here, swing as if it was a normal saber, and if you break it, then we'll know. So they definitely weren't going super light. And one of the reasons that we know that this would be a good training weapon is because you can hit it, and it sounds almost like a bell is ringing. You can see the center of percussion on this sword, when I smack it, is right about there, which is usually where you want it to be on a cutting section of a sword. This sword is not super stiff as well, so I can put it here on the end of my hand, and we push it in, and you can see we've got that nice bend in there. It kind of hurts my hand a little bit, so it's a little stiff. It's got that bend in the upwards third of the blade where we typically want it. It has a very slight curve to it as well. So if you see here, you have a very slight curve towards the end, right there. The end does not have a spatulated tip on it. It's just kind of a little bit swollen up on the top there. So I would recommend anyone that's going to be using this in a sparring context to have a piece of leather or maybe a rubber tip on the end, just to make sure that you're not going to accidentally stick that in your opponent with any sort of force. But yeah, overall, definitely not a bad option. This right here is the grip that they did on this one. They've got two different styles of grip. They have a cord wrap, then they have this weird one with a back strap. The back strap, we can't complain because it's a budget sword, but the back strap is a little weird right there where it'll catch on you. With gloves, it's not that big of a deal. This one has enough space that you can finger the guard pretty well without gloves on, just holding it down towards there. This was a traditional fencing style grip if you like to prioritize the point, especially in later cavalry actions. One of my favorite stories about the saber is you have a dude named Patton who is a controversial general from World War II, but he has his own military saber that was issued based on his advice back in World War I. And he basically advises the edges would be mostly blunt and you have a very straight saber, and you put this saber right out in front of you, guard to the outside, and you're charging on your horse and you just stick it into him. He prioritizes that right there. He was also a very famous Olympic fencer, so he likes the point. So if you prioritize the point, that's a great place. You have enough room without a glove to do that. A lot of saber fencers will do it just in like a handshake grip, very similar to what you'd be doing with like a long sword or any other type of arming sword. As we get later on in history, you can hold your arming sword like that. Holding your saber that way is also an option. So it really depends what style of saber fencing that you like best. Point thumb up, not point thumb down, because you can get a little bit more stability in that cut. That point allows you a little bit more nimbleness. So you can do things like a disengage, where if you are cutting at your opponent or your opponent cuts at you, you can disengage under their blade and stick it into them. So it depends on what style you're looking for. Now, the question that everyone is asking, or at least people that have done saber fencing before, is can you fence with this in a glove? I'll go ahead and put this on. This is the Spec Heavy Glove. This is the medium size here, so this would be considered a very bulky glove. Most people use for a long sword, and you can fit it in the guard. Now, it's not the most comfortable thing in the world. I can't thumb grip like this, though. So if you're doing a handshake grip, that fits fairly well. You can see there's that little tiny air gap in front of it. You always want to check before you have any kind of fencing equipment that you're buying that your gloves will fit into there, and you have a little bit of an air gap so your hand can rotate a little bit. And we can still swing this with some amount of ferocity and force without it shifting in your hand. So historically, this guard would have been much smaller because we were talking about these are usually going to be used with gloves that are not any kind of armored, maybe just a pair of leather gloves, if anything, or some buckskin gloves earlier in history. Because we're in HEMA, we need to be extra safe protecting our hand. So having a heavy glove on the inside is not a bad idea. You might be able to get away with more light gloves, things like Purple Heart, saber gloves, especially. So if you have the full bell, you might not need a full thing or a full gauntlet on the inside of the sword. Because of that, I'd recommend looking at any tournaments that you want to go to and seeing what the rules are. A lot of them say if you have a full bell that you just need some light gloves underneath. I always recommend some kind of cuff on the back as well, because anyone that's been doing any amount of saber fencing knows that it's really easy to hit somebody on the inside right there or on the outside right there as you're blocking. So look at your local tournament rules, and that will tell you a lot more about it. The sword, I believe, is sort of peened. You can see that we have a nut here on the end that you can use to unscrew and take the blade out. But the blade, if you look down there, is welded to the guard. So it's, in my opinion, pretty ugly, but a strong construction. The new one looks a lot better because it has perforations in the guard, so it weighs less. And then this termination on top is much easier. You also have a slight lip on the back there. So if for whatever reason you decide to do an inside lock where you cut in their sword and then you flip your sword over so that their sword's on the inside, but your point's on line, you can dive in with that curve in the blade, kind of like we've talked about before. You have a little bit of a lip there to protect you. And I found we've caught a few blows on there. And because the bell is rolled all around the outside, you have a pretty sturdy edge. So overall, I think it's definitely a workhorse sword. I wouldn't expect some like Martialis level of saber, or even things like a Kvetin or an Easton saber. But if you're just looking for kind of just a beater sword, and we're not primarily a saberist, I'd say this is pretty good. So if we're taking price out of the equation on this sword, I'd probably give it about a 5 out of 10. If we consider how cheap it is and our ability to just put a saber in people's hands who wouldn't ever have it, I'd probably give it like a 7 or an 8 out of 10. Just because it is a workhorse and it doesn't feel bad at all. Like, it's balanced fairly well, a little bit out from the guard there. It doesn't weigh a whole ton. It's just about over 2 pounds. But yeah, it feels kind of like a forward heavy rapier, which is cool. So, I mean, if you are into saber or you want to get started with it, I'd definitely recommend this one. And then once you become a master and you're rated into the top 100, you can upgrade to something better. So I think that feels like a really good budget roll for sabers. But yeah, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe so we can grow the channel. We're trying to increase our watch time as well, so I appreciate you sticking towards the end. Like, share, and subscribe, and then we'll go ahead and keep you appraised as to how we're doing. Thanks so much.
All right. Yeah, I really like this sword. I feel like it moves really nicely. I feel like it's got good protection that'll fit almost any glove. I would say it doesn't cross-cut all that well, but for kind of more typical infantry-style fencing, I think it's really fun. Oh yeah. So these are the HF Black Princes, which are low profile, but you can see that there's tons of room on every side to move my grip around. It's really nice.
Alright, I mean, I like the shape of it. For me, it doesn't feel like it moves as well whenever I try to do something really snappy and fast. I feel like I have to do more flow through with it, and my game is typically really fast and snappy, and it's a little bit slower. I'm not quite sure if it's because the weight's a little bit more forward on this, but I feel like I have to do basically one committed and wait for it to come all the way around, as opposed to being able to pull back as easily as I can with some others.